Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling a topic that's been making the rounds online. The Big Pharma conspiracy.
Weird.
Yeah, the one where these huge pharmaceutical companies are, well, basically the villains, right? We've got a ton of research on this, some sent in by you guys, and let me tell you, there's a lot to unpack here. So for those who haven't gone down this particular rabbit hole, what exactly does this conspiracy theory claim? The gist of it is Big Pharma, these massive companies, are putting profits ahead of people's, well-being, to put it lightly. Some even say they're hiding cures for diseases, like imagine a cure for cancer already exists, but it's locked away somewhere. Sounds pretty wild, right? Now, the interesting thing is the research we've got actually digs into both sides of this. Arguments for the conspiracy and, get this, arguments against it. So we're going to try and give you a balanced view, present all the evidence. What do you think?
It's a fascinating topic for sure. And I think it's important to start by acknowledging that, there are some legitimate concerns about the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, the cost of medications, for example, is a huge issue for many people, like the price of insulin. It's skyrocketed in recent years, and that's caused real hardship for those who need it to survive. Then you've got the way some companies market their drugs. Some of their tactics have definitely raised ethical questions. So it's not like people's concerns are coming out of nowhere. There are real issues here, and we'll definitely be exploring those as we go through the evidence.
Absolutely. So let's dive right in. Let's start with the arguments that support this big pharma conspiracy. The research lays out three main points. The first one, and this is a big one, is the idea of suppressed cures. The theory that cures for major diseases like cancer might already exist, but they're being kept from the public. Then there's the argument about price manipulation and profit motive. Basically, the idea that Big Pharma is intentionally keeping drug prices high to maximize profits, even if it means people can't afford the medications they need. And finally, there's the claim that Big Pharma has its tentacles everywhere, influencing research outcomes and even controlling regulatory agencies like the FDA.
Okay, let's break these down one by one. Let's start with the suppression of cures. The first thing to consider is just how complex medical research really is. Developing a new drug, let alone a cure, is a massive undertaking. It can take decades, involve thousands of researchers across universities, hospitals, private companies all over the world. The idea that one company could suppress a major discovery on a global scale, well, it's just not really feasible.
You're saying it's not like they've got a secret lab somewhere with a cure for everything just locked away.
Exactly. If a researcher discovered a cure for a devastating disease, believe me, the world would know. I mean, think about it from the researcher's perspective. They'd want recognition for their work. And the potential to save millions of lives would be a huge motivator. Plus, there's the financial reward. A cure for a major disease would be worth a fortune.
That makes sense. And the research also points out that a lot of medical breakthroughs actually happen outside of big pharma, in university labs and smaller research institutions. So it's not like one giant entity is controlling everything. Okay, so what about the price manipulation argument? I mean, like we talked about with insulin, the cost of medications is a serious problem for a lot of people.
It absolutely is. And it's understandable why people are angry about high drug prices. But the issue is, well, it's more complicated than just saying it's corporate greed. Developing a new drug can cost billions of dollars, and the success rate is pretty low, around 12%. That means for every drug that makes it to market, there are many that fail, and companies have to recoup those losses somehow.
So you're saying it's not as simple as big pharma just choosing to charge outrageous prices.
Right. There's also the issue of patents. Imagine you invent something new, like a gadget or a piece of technology. A patent gives you the exclusive right to sell that invention for a certain period. That way you can make back your investment and profit from your idea. Pharmaceutical companies get patents for new drugs too. It allows them to charge higher prices for a limited time. But the good news is once the patent expires, other companies can start making generic versions of the drug, and those are usually much cheaper.
Okay, so that explains part of it. But there's still this concern about big pharma's influence, right? Like the research mentions the FDA and how they might be under the thumb of the industry they're supposed to be regulating.
Yeah, that's a valid concern, and it's something we should be aware of. But you have to remember, the FDA's job is to ensure the safety and effectiveness of new drugs. They have a very rigorous approval process with multiple phases of clinical trials, independent panels of experts, and public hearings. So while there have been cases where companies have tried to exert undue influence, the FDA does have safeguards in place.
Can you give us an example of that? Like, how does the FDA actually prevent that kind of manipulation?
Sure. One example that comes to mind is the Vioxx scandal back in the early 2000s. Vioxx was a popular painkiller, but it turned out the manufacturer had hidden evidence of serious heart risks associated with the drug. The FDA investigated, and despite the company's attempts to downplay the issue, Vioxx was eventually pulled from the market.
Wow, that's a pretty strong example of the FDA acting independently.
It is. And it shows that while no system is perfect, there are checks and balances in place to protect the public. The FDA also has the authority to fine companies or even prosecute them if they engage in unethical practices.
All right, so we've looked at some of the arguments in favor of this big pharma conspiracy, but there's another side to this story, and that's what we'll be exploring next. Stay with us.
So we've talked about some of the reasons why some folks think there's this big conspiracy, but let's look at the other side of the coin now, right?
Yeah, the research actually has quite a bit of information that challenges these claims.
It does. And one of the biggest things that kind of throws a wrench in this whole conspiracy idea is just how incredibly complex drug development is.
We touched on that a bit earlier, but you're saying that complexity itself is a reason to be skeptical.
Exactly. Think about it. Medical research is this massive global endeavor. Like there are thousands upon thousands of researchers working at universities, hospitals, private companies, you name it.
All over the world, right? Not just in one place.
Right. So to believe that one company, even a really powerful one, could control all of that and suppress a cure, well, it seems pretty far-fetched.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think you mentioned earlier there are something like over 10,000 clinical trials happening around the world at any given moment.
That's right. It's mind-boggling, really.
Yeah.
It just shows you how decentralized this whole process is.
So it's not just about the research itself, right? There's also the whole process of getting a new drug approved.
Absolutely. And that involves a ton of scrutiny from independent review boards, government agencies. It's not just one company calling the shots.
So even if a company did want to hide a cure, it's like almost impossible to do it without someone finding out.
Exactly. There are just too many people involved, too many eyes on the process, and the consequences of a cover-up would be huge.
I hadn't really thought about that. But there are also like financial reasons why suppressing a cure wouldn't make sense, right?
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. If a company discovered a cure for something like cancer or Alzheimer's, it would just be a huge scientific breakthrough. It would be a financial gold mine.
You're saying there's actually more money to be made by curing a disease than by treating it long term.
In many cases, yes. The potential profits from a cure would be astronomical, not to mention the positive PR and reputation a company would gain. Why
Yeah.
would they hide that?
Yeah, that makes sense. And on top of that, there's the whole competition aspect, right? Other companies wouldn't just sit back and let one company monopolize a cure.
Exactly. The pharmaceutical industry is fiercely competitive. If one company was suppressing a cure, you can bet their rivals would be racing to develop their own version and bring it to market, ASE.
So the competition itself kind of acts as a safeguard against this whole conspiracy idea.
Right. It just wouldn't make sense from a business perspective for a company to suppress a cure when there's so much to gain by releasing it.
Okay, that's a really interesting point. So we've got the complexity of the research, the financial incentives, and the whole competitive landscape all working against this idea of a massive conspiracy. But what about the FDA? Earlier we talked about how they have these checks and balances in place, but there's always this lingering suspicion that they might be too cozy with the industry they're regulating.
Yeah, that's a valid concern. It's definitely something we need to keep an eye on as citizens, as patients. But remember, the FDA's primary responsibility is to protect public health.
So even if there's potential for conflicts of interest, their main goal is still to make sure drugs are safe and effective.
That's right. And while there have been controversies and criticisms, the FDA has a pretty long history of taking action against companies that break the rules or put profits ahead of patient safety.
So it's more complicated than just saying the FDA is in Big Pharma's pocket.
Definitely. It's a complex relationship, and it requires careful scrutiny and accountability from all sides.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of the evidence that goes against this big pharma conspiracy theory, the complexity of research, the financial incentives, the role of competition, and the FDA. But there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to talk about, and that's vaccines.
Yeah, vaccines are definitely a hot button issue.
Mm.
And they often get pulled into these conspiracy theories with claims that Big Pharma is exaggerating the risks of diseases just to make more money from vaccines.
But the scientific consensus is pretty clear, right? Vaccines are one of the most effective public health tools we have.
Absolutely. I mean, we've eradicated smallpox thanks to vaccines,
Yeah.
and diseases like polio and measles, which used to be huge threats, are now incredibly rare in many parts of the world.
And the process for developing and approving vaccines is just as rigorous as it is for other drugs, right?
Absolutely. They go through years of testing clinical trials, and then they have to be reviewed by regulatory agencies like the FDA. It's a very thorough process.
But there's still people who are hesitant about vaccines, even fearful. How do we address those concerns in a way that's respectful and productive?
That's a great question. I think the key is to approach vaccine hesitancy with empathy and understanding. Often those fears stem from misinformation or a lack of trust in institutions. So we need to have open and honest conversations, provide accurate information, and address people's concerns with patience and respect.
So it's not about dismissing people's worries or labeling them as anti-science. It's about engaging in a dialogue that's based on facts and evidence.
Exactly. And we also need to acknowledge the historical context. There have been times in the past where certain communities were exploited or mistreated in the name of medical research.
Right, and that's led to a distrust of medical institutions among some groups, which is understandable.
Absolutely. So
Okay.
building trust is essential. And that means listening to people's concerns, acknowledging past wrongs, and working to ensure that healthcare is equitable and accessible for everyone.
Okay, so we've talked about the evidence against this big pharma conspiracy, the role of the FDA, and the importance of vaccines. What are some of the key takeaways from all of this?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that the pharmaceutical industry is incredibly complex. There are definitely legitimate concerns about things like drug pricing and corporate influence. But the claim that they're deliberately suppressing cures just doesn't hold up when you look at the evidence.
It seems like the reality is a lot more nuanced than these conspiracy theories often suggest.
Exactly. It's important to be critical thinkers, to question the information we come across, and to avoid falling into these overly simplistic narratives.
All right, so we've debunked some myths, explored the complexities, and even touched on the sensitive topic of vaccines. But we're not done yet. There are still some real concerns about the pharmaceutical industry that we need to address. And we need to talk about what we can do to make it more ethical and more patient-centered. So stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive where we'll explore those questions in more detail. It's interesting, even though the whole suppressed cures thing doesn't really hold up, there's still this underlying anxiety, right? Like, people are worried about big pharma, and I get it.
Absolutely, and I think that anxiety comes from a real place.
Right.
There are legitimate concerns about the pharmaceutical industry.
Exactly. It's not just paranoia. So let's talk about solutions. If we want a more ethical, more transparent pharmaceutical industry, where do we even begin?
Well, I think transparency is a big one. When it comes to drug pricing, it's kind of a black box right now, isn't it? People don't really understand how those prices are determined.
Right. It just seems like a random number sometimes.
Yeah. So we need more clarity. Break it down for us. Research and development, manufacturing costs, marketing, lay it all out.
Okay, so transparency is key. What about the role of government? Can regulations help make drug prices fairer? Can they hold companies accountable for bad behavior?
For sure. Stronger regulations are crucial. We need policies that prevent price gouging, that make sure companies are putting patients before profits.
And how do we actually make that happen?
Well, there are a few things that could help, like maybe limit how much companies can spend on marketing, or give government agencies more bargaining power when negotiating drug prices.
Makes sense. But Big Pharma, they've got a lot of lobbyists, a lot of influence. That's a tough battle.
It is. And that's why we as citizens need to make our voices heard. We need to demand transparency, hold our elected officials accountable.
Yeah, support organizations that are fighting for a better healthcare system.
Absolutely. We can't just rely on the government to fix everything.
Right. So what can we do as individuals? Besides staying informed, contacting our representatives, is there anything else, like practical tips for navigating this whole system?
Well, first and foremost, be proactive. Be an empowered patient.
What does that actually look like?
Ask your doctor questions. Don't be shy. What are the different treatment options? Are there generics available? Don't be afraid to get a second opinion if you're not comfortable.
Right, advocate for yourself.
And if you're having trouble affording your medications, there might be programs or resources available. Talk to your doctor. Talk to your pharmacist.
Great advice. So it's been a really interesting deep dive, wouldn't you say? I mean, this whole pharmaceutical industry, healthcare in general, it's complicated.
It is. It's messy. But you know what? I'm feeling a little bit hopeful. We've talked about solutions, and I think we all have a role to play in making things better.
I agree. Knowledge is power, right? The more we understand, the better we can advocate for ourselves, for our families, for a system that works for everyone.
That's what it's all about.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So, to everyone listening, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep fighting for a better healthcare system. We'll see you next time.